Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees and here are today's top stories. The UK marks 1 year since its first national lockdown. Police are starting an investigation into the Bristol riots and more arrests are imminent. And new rules from next week mean going on holiday abroad may result in a £5,000 fine. Britain is marking the 1 year anniversary of its first lockdown. NTD's Neil Woodrow has the details.
Today is about reflection, a minute's silence held at midday. For the whole year since the first lockdown began, the UK has been under some form of restrictions, and more than 126,000 people have lost their lives to the virus, a toll few could have imagined back in March 2020. It's been 12 months since the UK went into its first full lockdown. Everything stopped. On March 20th, Prime Minister Boris Johnson began the stern warnings.
I've got to be clear, we've all got to be clear, this is the worst public health crisis for a generation.
Then on March 23rd, a singular instruction.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
It was in 2019 when the world first heard of this virus. In China, Dr. Wen Liang was one of those who alerted social media in late December about an unknown pneumonia outbreak in the Chinese city of Wuhan. On January the 3rd, 2020, he was forced to sign a confession statement. It warned that he would be punished by the law if he continued such illegal activities. A short while later, he died of the CCP virus or Chinese Communist Party virus on February the 7th. The UK announced its first reported death from the virus on March 5th. It wasn't until March 11th, 2020 that the WHO announced the outbreak to be a pandemic. And the future is still not plain sailing.
Cast your mind back a good few months ago, we'd come out the first wave and we thought everything was going in the right direction, and to go back a number of steps now and do it all again, that concerns me. Yeah, I mean, me and other people, we're anxious just to get back to normal.
Tuesday evening, landmarks across the United Kingdom from the London Eye, Trafalgar Square and Wembley Stadium to Cardiff Castle and Belfast City Hall will be lit up in yellow as a beacon of hope and support for the bereaved. People are also being encouraged to stand on their doorsteps at 8 p.m. with phones, candles and torches to signify a beacon of remembrance. Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Tuesday praised the great spirit of the nation. He referred to this anniversary as an opportunity to reflect on the past year, a year that he called one of the most difficult in our country's history. Neil Woodrow, NTD News, London.
Avon and Somerset police say they have started an investigation into the riot on Sunday night and more arrests are imminent. Police say more than 100 officers and staff are working on the inquiry.
So far, 8 people have been arrested, 6 for violent disorder and 2 for possessing an offensive weapon. It's the aftermath of Sunday's protest turned riot in Bristol. With an enormous amount of digital evidence to go through, including CCTV footage, body-worn video and social media coverage, the investigation is now underway. Police also collected some forensic evidence including fingerprints, and they're calling out for people to provide video footage and photos. Once an initial view of the evidence is done, police will release images of suspects and hope the public will help to identify them. A police spokeswoman said, "From what we've already collated, we're confident more arrests are imminent." Police thanked the public for their support, including the flowers and accompanying messages. About 500 people were involved in the riot when an attempted siege took place in Bridewell police station. Its windows were smashed and 2 police vans were burnt. 21 police officers were injured, 2 of them seriously. And what started it all? A demonstration against a government bill that would give police new powers to restrict protests.
New rules set to come into force next week mean anyone in England trying to go abroad on holiday risks a £5,000 fine. But protests outdoors will be allowed again. Here's NTD's Jane Wowell with the details.
As England continues on its roadmap out of lockdown, MPs will vote on a raft of new measures later this week. Among those measures is a hefty fine of £5,000 for going abroad without a reasonable excuse. While current rules mean we aren't allowed to go on holiday abroad, this £5,000 fine is a new measure. If passed, it will come into force from the 29th of March. The regulations say there's a need for the rules to be reviewed by the 12th of April and every 35 days after that. The laws expire on the 30th of June, unless they're scrapped beforehand. Some Conservative MPs say they'll vote against it, but it's expected to pass in the Commons this week. Under the government's roadmap out of lockdown, May 17th is the earliest date to travel abroad without a reasonable excuse. The Health Secretary stresses that the final decision of this date is yet to be made.
It is now too early to know where the Global Travel Task Force will come out and know what the decision will be for the 17th of May. And the reason for that is that we are seeing this third wave rising in some parts of Europe, and we're also seeing new variants.
England will move into its next stage out of lockdown on Monday, when people will be allowed to meet outdoors in groups of 6 or 2 household bubbles can meet. Also in the rules is the addition of protests as an exemption in the ban on mass gatherings, as long as required precautions are taken. It follows pressure from campaigners and MPs to make the rules around protests clearer. The vote on the regulations will happen in Parliament on Thursday. Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.
British Airways and other airlines worry that European countries could be added to a red list, so they are cancelling summer holiday flights to Europe. NTD's Patrick Hayden has the story.
UK airlines are axing summer flights to Europe. British Airways has already cancelled flights over June and July, according to The Telegraph. The airlines fear that once UK travel restrictions could be eased on the 17th of May, there will only be a small number of EU countries that will be on a green list. Health Minister Lord Bethell told the Lords CCP virus rates in Europe were surging around 10%, linked in part to new variants. And that could mean drastic measures are needed. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has also refused to rule out an extension on the travel ban. Patrick Hayden, NTD News, London.
The UK job market appears to be stabilising, but it is still a long way from its normal levels. In the 3 months to February, the number of workers on company payrolls increased by around 200,000, but the number is still nearly 1,700,000 lower than a year ago, before the first COVID-19 lockdown began. According to the Office for National Statistics, nearly 2 million people are still out of work. The people aged under 25 have been hit particularly hard. China's foreign ministry has summoned the British and the European Union's ambassadors to make a solemn protest against newly imposed sanctions. The UK announced the sanctions on Monday against Chinese officials over human rights abuses in Xinjiang in coordination with the US, Canada and the EU.
Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab says the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang is one of the worst human rights crises of our time.
Having very carefully considered the evidence against the criteria in our global human rights sanctions regime, I can tell the House today that I am designating 4 senior individuals responsible for the violations that have taken place and persist against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang.
An organisation responsible for enforcing the repressive security policies is also included. The 4 Chinese officials are barred from entering the UK. Any assets found in the UK will be frozen.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of scale, it's the largest mass detention of an ethnic or religious group since the Second World War. And I believe one thing is clear: the international community cannot simply look the other way.
It's the first time the UK has targeted Chinese officials with its Magnitsky-style sanctions since they were adopted in July 2000. Some MPs believe the government could do more, including imposing sanctions on Chen Quanguo, the head of Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, and on Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party.
The buck for all of this stops with the president of China, who was recently quoted as saying about the Uyghur people that they, the Chinese, should show them no mercy. When do we start calling his name?
Raab says that the UK is taking the action alongside the EU, the US and Canada. The sanctions targets the same officials and organisation.
Along with summoning the EU ambassador, Beijing has blacklisted a number of EU officials. The move is thought to be in retaliation to the newly added EU sanctions on China.
On Monday, the EU named 4 Chinese officials and 1 company that will be subject to the penalties. The sanctions were announced last week, but the affected entities weren't revealed at the time. The penalties include travel bans and having all EU-based assets frozen. As for the sanction list, it targets the director of the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, 2 senior Chinese officials, and the former head of China's Xinjiang region. Alongside those 4, Xinjiang's Public Security Bureau for Production and Construction has also been sanctioned. All 27 EU countries agreed to the new sanctions, but Hungary called them harmful. Beijing immediately responded to the sanctions announcement, levying its own sanctions on 10 EU officials and 4 entities. Beijing also warned the EU against going down what it called the wrong path and urged it to correct its so-called mistake.
An independent inquiry found that Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon didn't breach ministerial code. But on Tuesday, a Scottish parliamentary committee said Sturgeon had misled it over evidence she gave about her handling of sexual harassment complaints.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was cleared on all counts of breaching the ministerial code on Monday. Lawyer James Hamilton QC delivered his independent report after an over 2-year investigation into the way she handled sexual harassment complaints against her predecessor.
I've always been of that view, but independent adjudication of that is important to me, but it's also important to the Scottish public to know that in the opinion of somebody whose independence is completely beyond reproach, I did not breach the ministerial code, so I'm delighted and of course relieved about that.
However, on Tuesday, a Scottish parliamentary committee said Sturgeon had misled it over evidence she gave on her handling of the complaints. On top of that, Sturgeon is facing a vote of no confidence on Tuesday. With the Scottish parliamentary elections coming up in May, and Sturgeon vowing to press for a second independence referendum if her Scottish National Party wins an absolute majority, this may put a dent in her plans.
It's been 1 year since the UK government started its first lockdown, forcing pubs, restaurants and so-called non-essential businesses to close.
It's now 1 year since the UK started its first lockdown. In Britain, almost 10,000 premises, including pubs, restaurants and nightclubs, were forced to close permanently. One large pub owner in Derbyshire has managed to weather the storm so far.
I mean, we've been abreast of the news, so we knew that things were starting to get bad. It still never felt like a shutdown was coming. And yeah, the realisation, kind of brutal. And we thought weeks, not months, not a year.
4.7 million people lost their jobs and have been forced to rely on the government's furlough scheme.
So it's been like 15, 20 years of building this business up to what it is now, and we have 68 staff, I think, on furlough currently, but the team's bigger than that still, if we take in the sort of students that come back in the summer, and yeah, it's kind of been brutal.
Britain has one of the fastest vaccine rollouts in the world, and health ministers said on Saturday that half the country's adults had been inoculated. That will go some way in providing hope to the hospitality industry, in getting businesses up and running again.
Coming up, a genocide amendment of the trade bill passes in the Commons, and it may prevent the UK from trading with countries engaging in genocide. That and more when we return. The government has revealed details of what it says is the biggest shake-up to the British military since the Cold War. It means fewer tanks, more robotic ships, and a new role for the Royal Marines.
More robots in the sky, but fewer boots on the ground. That's part of the government's ambitious military refit.
The armed forces, working with the rest of government, must think and act differently. They will no longer be held as a force of last resort, but become a more present and active force around the world.
The budget is up by 14% over the coming 4 years, but troop numbers will drop to record lows.
The Army's increased deployability and technological advantage will mean that greater effect can be delivered by fewer people. I've therefore taken the decision to reduce the size of the Army from today's current strength of 76,500 trade-trained personnel to 72,500 by 2025.
The government described the official defence review as the biggest shake-up since the Cold War.
It marks a shift from mass mobilisation to information age speed, readiness and relevance for confronting the threats of the future.
It's part of a broader review of foreign policy. The government is pumping money into developing military space and cyber capabilities, along with unmanned aerial systems. But the new plans will also reduce tanks, and logistical warhorses like the Hercules transport aircraft will be retired early. That raised concerns among some military analysts.
Historically, the British Army had 1,200 main battle tanks at the start of the First Gulf War, 1990. It's now going to be reduced from a current fleet of 227 to just 148. So that's enough for 2 armoured regiments, which is almost, it's not even a token amount. It's not even a token force. There is very little you can do with 2 armoured regiments in the grand scheme of things.
Meanwhile, the Royal Marines are becoming SAS-style Special Operations Forces, the future Commando Force. They will be joined by another Special Ops regiment, the Rangers.
So it's this much more light footprint, expeditionary in nature deployment capability the Marines will have going forwards.
The MOD wants them to tackle what is called grey zone competition. That means hustling for advantage with the likes of China and Russia without firing a shot.
The notion of war and peace as binary states have given way to a continuum of conflict, requiring us to prepare our forces for more persistent global engagement and constant campaigning.
That grey area between war and competition includes information warfare, such as online disinformation campaigns launched by China and Russia.
With the Special Forces almost leading on this in collaboration with both MI6 and GCHQ, you're blending traditional capabilities and non-conventional capabilities with the intelligence and the cyberspace. So it's very interesting going forwards, absolutely.
The Navy too is being refitted to face threats of a digital age. 13 minesweepers will be replaced with a fleet of robots. And a new spy ship will be built to protect the underseas cables that keep the nation hooked up to the internet.
After a months-long debate, a genocide amendment passed in the Commons allowing a major trade bill to go ahead. The government was able to push through its own version, defeating a stricter one. Lily Zhou has a story.
Thank you, Madam.
The UK government on Monday won a tight race between 2 versions of a genocide amendment, clearing the last hurdle for its post-Brexit trade bill to become law. The amendment may potentially prevent the UK from entering trade deals with countries engaging in genocide. The government defended its own version that would set up a select committee.
We are not asking Parliament to make a determination on whether genocide has occurred. We are instead supporting a process that guarantees scrutiny and debate, where Parliament has established for itself that credible reports of genocide exist.
A former Tory leader pointed out what he sees as flaws in the government version.
The second thing he knows very well, by the way, that we have allowed in this amendment the government to set the terms of how that will sit, the balance of evidence and the kind of peers that would sit in there, which is to do with the judiciary.
The alternative version by Lord David Alton instead favoured a committee of ex-High Court judges who would make a preliminary determination on genocide. On the same day, the UK announced sanctions on Chinese officials over alleged human rights abuses taking place in its Xinjiang region. One MP highlighted the contrast between the amendment and the sanctions.
The genocide amendment excludes the Uyghur. Considering everything that's been said today, I really think this is a shameful way to deal with our international and national responsibilities, and fundamentally sends a message that we have a 2-tier system in place.
Uyghur Muslims and other victims of alleged genocide in China are excluded because the amendment only deals with prospective free trade agreement partners which the UK government said China is not. In total, 29 Conservative MPs voted against the government version of the amendment. Nonetheless, human rights campaigner Luke de Pulford, who drafted the Alton Amendment, said the campaign has altered genocide debate in the UK forever. He wrote on Twitter, "Massive advances made today for human rights. This campaign has secured huge wins, and UK genocide debate will never be the same."
8 pro-democracy activists returned to Hong Kong after months in jail in mainland China. But now they're facing criminal charges and immediate detention.
8 pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong are now in police custody. That's after they returned to the city on Monday. 12 Hong Kong activists attempted to flee the city last August and head for Taiwan by boat. They were trying to escape charges brought by Beijing over the city's pro-democracy protests. But they were intercepted by Chinese officials on their way. The 8 who just returned to Hong Kong were among them. Reuters reports that a van carrying one of the activists arrived at Tin Sui Wai police station on Monday morning. Pro-democracy activists have been fleeing Hong Kong since last summer, as Beijing's new national security law increasingly limits freedom in the city.
Following the first high-level meeting between China and the US under Biden, debate is still ongoing over why China's top diplomat behaved the way he did. One expert says he was actually trying to tell the world an important message about Beijing's true intentions. NTD's Juliet Song has the details.
How did the talks go? Discussions are hot following the first showdown between the Biden administration and Beijing. Top diplomats from both sides had their first in-person meeting last week. But people are still talking about what's behind some unexpected behavior from the Chinese Communist Party's or CCP's side. Prior to the meeting, both sides had agreed on 2-minute-long opening remarks. The U.S. side acted as planned, but top Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi broke the deal, going on a 16-minute-long monologue and aggressively throwing out accusations toward the U.S. One interpretation being passed around suggests China was putting on a show for its domestic audience. That way, the regime officials would be praised back at home for humiliating the U.S. But a China expert holds a different view.
He's using this opportunity, an opportunity where he held the world's attention, to share a message from the Chinese leader. So what's the core message? The message is that the Chinese Communist Party will stop recognizing that the U.S. is the world's leader, and that the CCP also won't follow international rules laid out by the U.S. On top of this, the CCP will promote its own values and directives around the world.
Tang says one section of the Chinese diplomat's long speech is particularly telling. In it, Yang said, the U.S. does not represent the world. It only represents the government of the United States. The Chinese diplomat went on to say that neither the U.S. nor the West represent the international opinion. He later added that he thinks a number of countries don't agree with American values or recognize the U.S. as a global leader. The diplomat also stressed one point, that China follows the international order set by the United Nations.
But many of the key organs of the United Nations and many of their critical policies are controlled by the CCP.
Tang says the diplomat's comments directly challenge the United States' ideology and value system.
The CCP is denying the United States legitimacy. It's also denying the Western values represented by the United States. Put simply, what the Chinese leader wants to say is, the Western values of democracy and freedom are current, but the totalitarian system represented by the CCP and its values is what will lead the future.
He called the diplomat's statement a declaration of challenge toward Western values.
Basically, the CCP is openly declaring that it seeks to dominate the world and promote its system to the entire world in the future.
Tang explained that the aggressive speech also served another purpose, to test the Biden administration's bottom line. He says the speech pushed White House officials, looking to see how they'd respond in the face of Beijing's aggressive diplomacy. Juliet Song, NTD News.
That's the news for today, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stuart Leith.